We want to offer as many of you an opportunity to have a question, to make a comment. We've got a limited amount of time and a lot of people, and quite a few people that you can question here. So all I would ask is that you, if possible, try to get a microphone. We have one on each side of the auditorium. We want to be sure and hear your question. If it needs repeated, we'll get one of the guys to repeat the question, or I will. So at this time, let's open it up for questions for our panelists.
Yeah, this question's for Scott and Dick. I wondered if you could address the dispute between the Bureau of Reclamation and the state with regards to Bonnie Reservoir, and how that might relate to the ruling on the Hutton Trust suit. I know there was a meeting last week, and wondered if you could bring us up to date where that's at.
Tell me if you... Oh, thank you. I can tell you as much as I know about the meeting and the dispute. Neither Dick nor myself was at the meeting. The dispute largely is between the Colorado Division of Parks and Wildlife and Reclamation over operation and maintenance fees that are associated with the recreation pool in the reservoir, and the Reclamation and Parks and Wildlife are trying to work out a future agreement to continue that relationship if possible. I don't know in the end what connection that will have with any associated water rights cases. So it's something at this point that the Division of Water Resources at least has stayed out of in terms of the negotiations between Parks and Wildlife and Reclamation.
Anyone else? Will, right down there.
It seems to me that the non-binding arbitration is doing nothing for us. What's your solution to that?
I don't know that well, I assume the question is directed at me.
It's always the attorney's fault.
Unfortunately, I don't have a choice, and the state of Colorado doesn't have a choice to give up on the non-binding arbitration process. I think I probably share some of your frustration personally. I think it has been beneficial in this case to a limited extent, and through that process, I think we were able to negotiate at least the one-year approval of the compact compliance pipeline. So unfortunately, in the future, we have to continue taking our disputes through that mandatory dispute resolution procedure, and we'll continue to try to negotiate where we can, and if we can't get to any agreement, then we can litigate an issue in the Supreme Court.
I guess my question is, I don't know who it would go to here, but anyhow, back when Kansas sued in 1998, I know Nebraska had a situation where they were still allowed to drill a lot of wells along there until, like, I think roughly 2005. The question I got is, do you feel that that really jeopardized a lot of this progress as that we're trying to make, as well as Kansas? Because being as I sit on the Frenchman Groundwater Board, I've also heard that Kansas has been drilling wells, not necessarily replacement wells, but new wells. And I was wondering if I could get an answer to that I could even take back home to let people know.
Do you want to address Kansas wells?
As far as Kansas goes, as I was kind of explaining earlier, there are areas in our district that are not declining. You know, if you don't have a declining problem, those areas haven't been closed yet by the state of Kansas. So they are still open for new wells. Those areas are very limited though, and our board has been moving in a direction to try to close more of those areas. If that kind of answers your question for Kansas.
Maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I think the actual, the NRDs adopted a moratorium when we settled with Kansas. I think that was in 2003. I do know that there was a big rush of people putting in wells at the last minute, and that has caused some grief in Nebraska for compliance. You know, Nebraska does have a law where these NRDs can treat those wells differently, I think, if they're drilled after, I believe, December 31st of 2001. So as to date, the NRDs have elected not to treat those wells differently, but they may have to revisit that going forward. So.
I'm assuming that the Ogallala Aquifer, or the High Plains Aquifer, whichever, runs from the north to the south. And I'm assuming all the water, say in South Dakota and Nebraska, is slowly moving down into Texas. So my question is even if Colorado quit pumping totally, would our aquifer still be going down because it's flowing into the other states that are still using it? And is there any study on that?
Certainly I'm not sure if this is picking up. I'm not certainly the expert to speak on the overall sustainability of the Ogallala, but certainly what everybody is doing is, collectively as a whole in that basin is going to have impacts. We know if, as Jim's pointed out in some of his presentation, that, if we discontinue pumping altogether, a large part of where the pumping's come from is storage, but we know there's still, from the recharge going on, that there's, based on the gradients that are out there, there's a migration of water from high gradients to low gradients. So to the extent those still exist in the basin as a whole, and those are influenced by pumping going on in all of the states, is going to dictate, the direction and movement of that water. And so the less pumping we're doing here and those water tables go up or stay at a certain level is going to affect, that flow over time. But that water moves really slow. I think the biggest impact is that pumping that's occurring on a daily basis as far exceeds the amount of recharge that's coming in, even though there is this migration in a general sense. But that rate of movement is certainly slow compared to the amount that's being vertically taken out of the aquifer. And I don't know if Jim wants to add anything to that or not, but I don't know to what extent, like going from South Dakota, North Dakota down to Texas. I mean, I got to believe over that aerial extent. I mean, we're talking geologic time in terms of that type of movement. That is, Jim, I think, pointed out some of his, that even in the Colorado portion where you're pumping, in the southern part of the basin versus northern, in terms of what effects there may be, is very limited. So if you're talking about on that small geographic scale, you got to believe that, on a large aerial extent, that what's happening, say, in Texas has little or no influence clear up into the Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska. But Jim may have something else to add to that, so you're not going to get out of this for free.
I did think I was going to get out of that. Really what happens is, you're right, they're all connected together, but it's literally thousands of years before what happens in South Dakota has any impact in Colorado. No matter what we do, the water levels in Colorado are extremely dictated by the amount of pumping in Colorado. So we kind of control our own destiny for the most part on the groundwater levels. Fell is next to the state line. Obviously what happens, across the state line will have an effect, but generally you have to realize that if you're over pumping, that's what's causing the decline. You can't blame it on some other state or some farmer 50 miles away from you.
Yes, go ahead.
I didn't realize the panel could ask questions.
But it's Tim.
It's Tim, though, so. I think you stated the overall direction is north to south, and I want to make sure that there's not a misconception there, as at least in Colorado, the predominant flow direction is actually west to east, and there's very little north to south influence.
Okay, now, go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your presentation. My name is Dobransky, and I live in Sedgwick County, and I haven't heard anybody address the fact of the water that the natural gas industry needs and the reservoirs that they're claiming that they're going to try to get proposed. Is there someone who could address that, or are we just being used for them?
Any one of the speakers like to address that?
I know that at least in Kansas, DWR actually handles all of our temp permits for any sort of drilling that would go on for any sort of fracking purposes. They don't consistently come through our office personally, although we have been looking at working more with DWR to enhance communication and get communities more involved in understanding the processes of getting those temp permits approved and for how much they're for and things like that. So I think it's probably up to us to enhance that communication, but I'm sure these guys might have a more technical answer for you, but. Right, I was sorry.
If I understood your question was in relation to the where the source of water is coming from for oil or gas production in Colorado. Right. If you go to our website, we've got a paper on there. We did some work a couple of years ago in conjunction with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to quantify the amount of water that's being used specifically in the fracking process, and it ranges from about and it continues to grow incrementally over the next few years, but it's on the order of about 15,000 to 18,000 acre feet a year is used for fracking purposes in the oil and gas production in Colorado, and that's statewide, but the predominant use is in northeastern Colorado in the Wattenberg DJ Basin, which is in the kind of north of Denver, up towards Greeley and Sterling, and up towards the state line, towards Wyoming. Just to put that in perspective, that 15,000 acre feet compares to about 16 million acre feet of total diversions on average for all purposes in Colorado. So it's a small fraction of that, and not trying to trivialize it, but just so people understand the relative magnitude of that. But these oil and gas companies are also seeking to try to be more efficient in their reuse process. What we've also seen recently, particularly in northeast Colorado, there's a big concern of hauling water for oil and gas development in general, but particularly for fracking, and trying to get those vehicles off the road. So there's been petitions made to our office for claims of non-tributary groundwater in some of these deeper formations in various locations. Most of the ones we've seen have been on the eastern plains of Colorado, and those are going through a process before our office, and in some cases before the water court, and to make determinations of how much water is available. That way they've got a local supply right in the field where they're developing those oil and gas activities to try to minimize the hauling water from other distances or taking it away from, say, agriculture, for example. That's been a concern that some people are saying, well, there's a demand and competing against and raising the prices for agricultural users. So that's currently kind of the landscape in Colorado, what we're seeing as far as water use and where they're seeking to get these alternative supplies for those purposes.
Yes, go ahead.
I would have to disagree with Mr. Lenz as far as the low cost of the tax. On certain wells, low producing wells, quite frankly, it's very expensive. And to me, it seemed like it would make a lot more sense if we based this fee or tax either split both on the irrigated acres that it was on as well as the amount produced. I mean, if you start putting the tax based on the amount of water, then that alone starts making one think about conservation. And I think right now, or I think to begin with, you needed to put it all on the land. I mean, that's the way you had to get started. But now that we have meters and some history, it seems like that should change it. I think we need to look at that just a little differently, at least on what could be done. And I know at the end of the day, you have to have X amount of dollars. And I understand that, and whether I agree or disagree, I understand that. And so I just think at some point, it would be best to look at reevaluating on how that is, how that money is attained, and so those low-producing wells aren't just getting the shaft, and because I think that's what's happening right now. And I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but
Okay. Thank you for the comment. Did you want to make a question out of it at all? Okay. Tim, do you want to take that one?
I might just comment before passing it to Tim that I know the district has struggled with this. They had the initial funding structure in place as the district was formed, as they were moving forward to try to create a stable base for revenue coming in as these programs were taking off. One of the things that we've been working with in the Rio Grande Basin with the entities down there as we develop the rules for well compliance is they assess a fee based on a dollar per acre foot, up to $75 per acre foot of net groundwater consumptive use as part of that fee structure they use to generate revenue, to take land out of production, to buy replacement water and so forth to offset the impacts from their wells down there. So it's not a foreign concept, but you've got to proceed through that in a thoughtful way to make sure that, one, you create a stable revenue base going through, but it incentivizes people to conserve water. I think most people recognize paying for what you use, just like you do in a house when you're metered for gas or water. You're a little more mindful and conscious of how much water you're using. So it makes sense, and I think I've heard the district talk about that they've still, I think, are exploring that, and it's still potential on the table. I don't want to speak on their behalf. I'll let Tim address that. But I just wanted to point out of what they're doing in other areas of the state as well as far as this fee assessment and how the different districts are handling it.
Kevin, I think a fair statement would be that, yes, we do need to revisit it. We're dealing with the counties and the assessor and the treasurer in order to collect all these monies. And that creates an issue for us to try to go back through there, because then it's very well specific then, rather than being basin-wide. We will revisit it with each one of the county assessors and treasurers and the commissioners and see whether they have an interest in working with us to try to achieve that. And we would certainly do it if in some way, shape, or form we could incorporate some kind of conservation in the equation as well. I mean, that's what it's about right now. So yes, I think we will make a concerted effort to revisit that issue again. Is that fair enough? You bet.
And I wanted to say the Water Preservation Partnership is all about listening to those ideas about how things might be done, especially in view of what kinds of policies might be undertaken to encourage conservation. So those ideas will be very important to bring out as this process goes forward.
Are there any more questions? One right there.
I have a question that I'd like to address to Brad, and that is in regards to the two districts that you talked about as far as pumping, the Rock Creek and the N Corp. Did you folks get a deed to those acres when you purchased the water?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that my board of directors weren't in favor of NCORP or the Rock Creek project and actually filed suit, but that was dismissed. I hate to speak on behalf of the NRDs, but I do know that they purchased the land, and it's my understanding they got a deed for the land, so, and then they retired the acres, so.
Anyone else?
One more question here, directed to the RRWCD. This survey you've started here is a start, but it's insufficient. You're going to need a lot more input from this group and from others that didn't show up today. How are you going to go about doing that?
Tim, after you get through, I'll make a comment or two.
Well, the intent is, excuse me, the RWCD has got its conservation committee. That committee is the one that has put on this symposium. The RWCD has paid for and funded this thing along with all the contributions. The next phase is to get the grant money established for the groundwater management districts to pick up the ball and start moving the conservation concept forward. It won't be the RWCD. We're certainly going to be a partner. Having said that, the funding from the South Platte Roundtable has been somewhat delayed. We've got to reapply, and that process isn't probably going to take place until sometime this fall. The original intent was, and we haven't talked with the partnership as a group, that's going to happen here maybe today yet, but what we'd like to do is continue to have these type of meetings, not necessarily to this extent, but evening meetings where we put it on a groundwater management district locale, so to speak. Be in Burlington, Rickery would maybe have one, and Idalia, Cheyenne Wells would have one. And it would be designed to bring in the public, all the stakeholders, for one of a better term, a town hall meeting type, where you just sit down in a smaller group, kick around ideas, get feedback. That's the intent. CSU would be part of that to help facilitate that process and to help us gather the information so that it would have credibility and to help us move through that process. That's what the intent is at this point. How it all unfolds, we're not 100% sure yet. And with that, I'll turn it over either to Dennis or Mary Lou.
Okay. When we began this morning, I said that our goal as a water conservation district and our speakers' task this morning and today was to begin the educational process on addressing where we're at and where we're headed in the future. You are the water users in Northeast Colorado. Vast differences of where you're at. Some of you are involved with your local communities, some totally rural ag water users, some of you dealing with lending and implement dealerships, banking. We've got such a broad spectrum here today. But there's one thing in common that we all have, that we share this resource. And it is not a given entity's responsibility to decide how that water resource is going to be used as far as its time in life. It's, unless each one of you take your responsibility to go to a groundwater management district board meeting, to come to an RRWCD board meeting. Hey, we've heard from folks, some that we didn't disagree with, some that vastly disagreed with us, but it's an open dialogue. So I urge you, yes, this survey is just the tip, the beginning, to ask the question, where do you want to go? How fast do you want to get there? What do you have? What do you want to be left? So what I want you to gain from this symposium is that you need to be involved. Commit right now to letting a board member from one of those groundwater management districts, from the RRWCD board, from your neighbors to talk and to determine and be thinking about water savings versus economy. How's it going to affect my local community? So be sure and turn in your surveys today. I'd like to thank our panel and for our speakers this morning. Let's give them a round of applause, please. I'd also like to be sure and thank our sponsors. Without the participation of our sponsors, we felt like that we would not be able to pull this off. Yeah, we'd be able to have it, but we would not be able to have the representation that we do here today. Tri-State, Highline, and YW for our meal sponsor. Thank you guys. Raymond Banks for catering the meal today. And all of our other individual sponsors, we thank you very much. Thank you to Jeremy Weathers. He has videotaped the symposium. It will be on our website. Our web address is republicanriver.com. I'm not sure how long it will take us to be able to get that on our website, but be checking and we will have it. Thank you, Jeremy, for getting that done. And also a couple personal thanks. Deb Daniel, our district manager, has put in hours upon hours working upon this symposium to get it off. And Don Webster, our administrative assistant, has really worked hard on all the technical things, and we appreciate both of them. So let's give them a round of applause, please. With that, I thank you for coming today. Let this just be the beginning of a dialogue. Thank you.